As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Business of Retail podcast. I'm Craig Patterson, and we're joined by a special guest today, Claude Sirois. He's the former president of retail at Ivanhoe Cambridge. And we've got our other panelists here, as we do regularly. We've got Christine Cowan, David Ian Gray, George Minikakis, and Gary Newbury. Welcome, everyone. Now, Claude, having been in the shopping center industry for quite a while and having knowledge, we're going to be talking a bit about brick and mortar retail. And I'll start off with a bit of an observation. One thing that I've noticed over a period of time, starting even in 2019 and before, was we started to see some retailers closing in shopping centers and generally in Canada. We had a pandemic, and now we're seeing some leasing activity improving, which is great. And we're looking for a bit of insights. So welcome.
Oh, thank you. First and foremost, thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to join you tonight. So yes, there's been a lot of articles written on retail in the past few years. We all heard about retail apocalypse and doom and gloom and et cetera. I mean, and a lot of it was fueled by what's happening in the US, and which was contaminating the Canadian retail scene, because obviously two different markets, two different positions, two different situations, overweight. I got to be careful when I say that about the US, but let's say overstored in the US or under demolished. Either way.
I like under demolished. That's great.
Yes. At 24 square feet of retail per person, compared to here, we're at 13, 14. But a lot of our retail business is driven by what's happening in the US, obviously. So yes, a lot has been written, different opinions. But when you dive in, it was not so much so doom and gloom. Yes, there were situations. Yes, we had, the departure of Target in 2013. And then that was, I don't remember, about 13 million square feet, 14 million square feet in the country. So that's a lot of retail to replace. And then I guess we were so good in repurposing that space, then how about having another 20 million square feet of Sears, right? So we've been disrupted, I think, ahead of our US friends, but we've been able to, repurpose the space, absorb the space to a great extent, and so obviously, there was a lot of capital spent by the retail developers in order to keep their malls relevant in every market. New experiences, about all the trends that relates to F&B, entertainment. So yes, a lot has been written, pre-COVID about retail in Canada, but it was not so doom and gloom. And if I look at the metrics that I was accountable for up until December 2019, our sales of our specialty retailers were up 1.8%. Our traffic was up 0.8%, if I'm not mistaken, at 247 million visits. We were doing deals, obviously, Craig, we were tracking all the foreign brands that, you were promoting in the country and bringing them into our shopping centers. So we were doing new deals, bringing new experiences. So it was not so doom and gloom, but I'm going to say this: we were somewhat in a consensual denial.
But I'm gonna plus on something you said though, Claude, which is the difference from the U.S. story. And a lot of our media motherhood belief system is generated out of U.S. media, and even people in the industry didn't quite realize what you were pointing out, that our square footage and our productivity in malls wasn't like it was in the States. But the other side of that was a lot of tech folks would be saying to me, "Hey, we need to get more and more of our retailers selling online. That's their salvation." And this is before 2019. I think the other big difference with the US is Canada's incredibly urbanized. Like most of our population is really clustered around our 6 or 8 major markets. And there's not a convenience effect like you have in the United States. Like we can get to a lot of malls within maybe 15-20 minutes drive time. So the problem to be solved wasn't quite as great as the US, where you've got little communities spread all over the place, or you've got mega cities like New York or LA where you're in traffic gridlock or you don't have a car. So I think there were some structural reasons why everything kind of was more or less working okay, let's say in 2019. And then back to consensual denial. Was that the phrase?
Yes.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because the other thing that I've discovered is I want to say about 2 or 3 years ago, I was interviewed by a paper, and I can't remember who the retailer was. They were exiting, or they had problems. And I said, bad news always leads to more bad news. And, so that ended up being the headline, which was good for me. But the interesting part about it is that is exactly what happens, right? That when a business actually announces that they're closing stores, or their financials are down, or their traffic is down, all of a sudden, the consumer in Canada, right, recognizes that as a signal that, well, this brand is done. So, you have that dynamic of American brands that might exit a Canadian market or any other market because they're not performing well. But then you have that dynamic of how consumers react to bad news.
And from that point on, George was known as Hurricane George.
Yeah, I think that stuck for a while. I prefer unvarnished truth, to be honest with you.
Well, I think, and Craig, you've been tracking this so well with Retail Insider for so long, but despite the fact there may or may not have been some malaise in homegrown Canadian retail, there was such a buildup of sort of global brands and brands going direct to consumer that were kind of trending, that I don't think the best malls were really having too much trouble, were they?
No, we seem to be seeing general success. I over a period of about 4 years, I was tracking the top 25 to 30 shopping centers, and even some that weren't on that list. And very few of them saw decreases year over year, or from the 1 year time period to the next time period that we were measuring, which was encouraging. And there may have been explanations for the 2 or 3 malls that did. They may have lost an anchor. They may have, a few things may have happened here and there. Who knows? You can't even explain it, but overall it seemed to be a good news story for the top shopping centers in the country. I'm not quite so sure about the secondary and the B and C malls, or tertiary, whatever terminology that we'd want to use. They may have struggled a little bit more, but Canada definitely has a set of really great top shopping centers, which are certainly, I'd say, leaders in North America. I don't want to say globally, because there's some really crazy places around the world that we don't have anything like it in Canada at the moment, mostly in Asia.
I mean,
And then Claude, sorry, I was going to say, Claude, I want to go back to the consensual denial, because that's a nice little teaser. But what was going on under the surface?
I think under the surface, we were, because sales were being generated by the assets, by the properties. Everybody was kind of, there was smoke all around the way we were doing business, which was a traditional way of doing business. But when you were looking a little bit deeper, and then when you were looking at the true general performance of the retailers, you could tell that some of them had, some challenges, obviously ongoing challenges, but also I hope that, not I hope, but I assume that some of them really like concrete blocks because there were walls being built in front of them, which they were not necessarily seeing, but it was going to hit them at some point, but they were going to hit them at some point. And what I'll say that is, it boils down to the allocation of capital. I think there is, for the retailers, and Christine can certainly talk about this, but it was a struggle to allocate capital, bricks and mortar, and the digital platform, the online platform. So there were, and for certain retailers, especially the ones that were from here, from Canada, those entrepreneurs that, I love them, okay? And they love their brand. And I can tell you many examples of, entrepreneurs that have really, throw a lot of their own money, despite the fact that they were in somewhat denial. They were not necessarily making rational decisions on their real estate, rational decisions on their operations, but emotional decisions. They didn't want to let go sometimes. And it's tough, right? I think this pandemic has completely changed the dynamic and accelerated a lot of the decisions by obligation. Otherwise, they were really, really going to get in trouble. But so that denial, and then also denial on the landlord side, right? When you have retailers that have grocs at 30, 40%, okay, yes, you're collecting the rent, but for sure, if you drill down, these retailers are probably barely making money, right? So we were collecting the rent and everything was fine. So there was a general consensual denial about some of the potential problems that could certainly arise from the situation that we're in right now.
Can I ask you a question? When you were at Ivanhoe, and let's say you go back 4 years or so, I remember doing a presentation and I was looking at the patterns, and the pattern was, remember back in the day, 10 years ago, maybe more now, I keep thinking everything was recent, but we had the big power centers. That was the craze, right? Everyone wanted these big boxes. But the relatively sudden shift to saying we've got to get rid of real estate and we've got to really shrink the real estate, that seemed to start to speed up quite a bit. And every retailer at a conference executive would say, because our customers are asking for it. And I have to say that was total BS. Like, first of all, I never wanted to drive to a farmer's field to go to this ginormous warehouse in the first place. But once I got used to doing that, I wasn't saying, hey, I want to have like a long tail on the web that I have to figure out. I just want to get my stuff. But what I think was driving it, Claude, was the fact that when you look at the P&L, it's that rent component kept becoming bigger and bigger as a chunk. And I just wonder, like, did it ever sort of get bandied about, like, hey, if we start to take too much of that, we're going to drive these guys into the online world as opposed to the customer pulling them?
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, but I think there's also, if you look back at the last 5, 7, 8 years, okay? And I'm just going to pull back for a second and take the landlords and retail developers view. Yes, rent has increased, but the overall cost of a shopping center, of running a shopping center, have increased as well significantly. Because just take the values of those shopping centers. They have increased dramatically, and obviously by default, the municipal taxes have increased. All the gross costs, and then obviously those some of the costs are recoverable from tenants, and then you're left with the rent. But at the end of the day, were the sales growing at the same or faster pace than all the costs. In certain cases, yes. In other cases, no. And then this is where the lines at one point in time, they go in sort of a wide direction, and that's where it creates tension. Now, did we by default push the consumers towards online? Is that what you were kind of alluding to?
As opposed to the consumers naturally saying we want to shop more online, I think a lot of the retailers were really reacting to how do we grow with the cost structure we've got, the bottom line. Well, we could do it by saving inventory, staff, and real estate if we get smaller.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, the consumer decides, which channel he wants to use the morning he gets up. And more, and obviously this pandemic, I think, is going to be interesting in terms of going forward. He's channel agnostic. The consumer is clearly channel agnostic, and that's a challenge. And that's a challenge for the retailers.
And that speaks to how relevant the brand is, right? Mm-hmm. And if the brand's not relevant, how does it survive in any environment, right? Online or offline? It can't. And then the consumer is the ones that are really deciding, I'm excited by this proposition, or I'm not, right? And I believe a lot of them have come and gone. And like Claude was saying, you've got these entrepreneurs who have opened 5, 6, 7 stores out there who've done and have a vision, but it may be misguided. They don't have a lot of that management strength behind them to help them guide them through building a brand and making it relevant in a world where it's the quick and the dead when it comes to brand relevance, right? You're either doing it right, executing it, or you're not, and that ends quick. I remember Vaughan Mills. There were a whole bunch of retailers that when that opened up, who went in, and I had a friend who owned a store there. Surprised that she got it. She was surprised that she got in. And there was another one that was in there. It was a bit of a furniture store, if you will, and it was unique. It was really a very unique location, but it lasted less than a year. And as unique as it was, it just doesn't resonate with the fact that this is an outlet mall, right? And they were trying to pitch themselves at a little more on the higher end. So I look at, I always ask, and over the years, Claude, we've always heard that malls are re-merchandising themselves, right? We've heard that terminology, and you wonder, sometimes, is it because there aren't enough players out there in some locations that it's just the distribution of retailers is not adequate enough, and that you end up with retailers that are not a good fit?
I think at the end of the day, you gotta put the consumers in your trade area in the middle of every decision you make, right? Mm-hmm. And this is so key. However, sometimes because we're in this denial, and depending how you approach things, you tend to forget: is this really going to serve the consumers that come into our shopping centers, or this is just a turn on the lights, fill up a hole and get some rent?
Yeah.
The thing is, in 6-12 months after, you might end up with that problem back in your hands, and then you got to deal with it all over again. So it's the mix has been evolving, and I think this accelerated in the last few years. Remember fast fashion, okay? I mean, when an F21 store was opening up, there were lineups outside. Okay, I don't think this is going to happen, in necessarily in the future for fast fashion. So, still, some categories have also evolved, over time, and what will be interesting to see is for every category, there will be new champions. There will be new retailers that will, stand out, that will harmoniously work their digital, their online and offline platform that work, very, very closely. And those are going to be the new champions and the winners going forward. But just
Um,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say we haven't touched on the COVID and the pandemic yet, but maybe that's almost what was needed then. If we're in the sort of reluctance to make the bold moves forward, I know when we do a lot of our discussions around the retail side of the fence, we talk a lot about the changes just really being predominantly accelerated through COVID as opposed to all of them being net new. And from what you're saying, it sounds like that was the case on the landlord side also. But I think that maybe it needed that kind of jarring impact and a drop off of the big backlog of the foreign brands in 2020 signing leases. I don't know.
Mhm.
The one other thing I might say too, for Chris, because Christine was sharing this last week with us. We also were talking about some of the big shopping centers, but there's a lot of other retail developments that are out there. There's high street, street front. Christine, you were talking about some kind of niche malls that were very well themed, and
Yeah.
I think the shopper had a lot of choice, even if not online. They had choice when it came to physicality also.
Well, it's interesting what Claude said about the mix, and definitely I'm totally on board with him around the consumer and what does the consumer want. And I feel like the traditional space was have every Gap store and Banana Republic and whatever else in every single mall across the country. And it was very, there was a model to that, and a consumer could go in and it's the same shop. And, then you start having all those shops across every single mall in Canada. And then you miss that eclectic diversity. And I feel like what we're starting to see is, the J. Crews and the whoever else, everyone's coming in, they're going broad, they're going everywhere they possibly can to get sort of a land grab real estate, showing that the brand's really strong. But then it gets to a point where there's like the cool factor's lost, because I could go into any mall anywhere and see the same store. And then I'm kind of like, I'm off it. I want to see something new and different. So I think like a lot of the European brands coming in, like a Zara and H&M back in the day, were something new and different and unique. Cause is another great store owned by H&M. And they started kind of bringing a different mix. And if I think about the malls that like I like to go to, either in Canada or down in the US, they're ones that have, some mainstays, but a lot of really interesting and unique brands in them. And there's something beyond just I'm going to a mall and walking up and down the aisle and, there's the food court and there's, I don't want all the basics anymore. As a consumer, I want more of an experience. So, I'd say we've talked about Oak Ridge the other day, and they're doing a massive redo. Back in the day, Oak Ridge was this lovely outdoor mall and you could look around and there's fountains, and it's sort of very much what you see down in the US and the southern part of the States where they're open air malls. And then eventually it evolved in the 80s. It was sort of this high glitz mall. And now I think we're getting into mixed use, which I think we'll talk about at another point. But I do think that consumers want a bit of that high street experience or experience from different and unique brands. So I think it's going to be really interesting because, do we go to a model? We were talking about this earlier where, in Asia, if the rents are only required for a couple of years, and here it's like a 10-year lease, that doesn't allow for the diversity that as a consumer you're coming in, you'd want to see. If you could get to more of like co-op type situations or ways to bring new and different brands in, they have small kiosks where you can bring in a Peloton, people can experience a brand that's maybe a little more direct to consumer. If that goes well, they can bring it in. Tesla's done it. So I think there's a number of really interesting brands out there that have tested the mall experience, but not done it in we're going to put it everywhere, but being really strategic with it. So, as a consumer, for me, I think what's most exciting are those unique situations, the unique malls that I can go to, someplace that has great brands that I want to check out. But it's just like when you go to your favorite shop, you don't want to see the same merchandise every single time you go. You want to see new and fresh and different. And I think that that's maybe where we're going to start seeing some change in the situation.
But as a product person, which is your forte, you're still interested in physicality, right? I mean, I hear Claude's point about the consumer, but I don't I study them all the time, and I don't feel like they have quite the power we think they do, because a lot of our decisions, we kind of give it to them. And what we're good at is we're super good gamers. Like we'll game the system pretty quickly. We learn how to shop well, but we're not totally designing our own futures. I do think if the big brands like Nike or Adidas, if they just said we're out of physicality because we think our consumers are all heading online, that would be a different story. But
Well,
about
it's interesting in that side as you think about Adidas and Nike and some, Puma and some of the other brands. Back in the day, it was around the flagship. So it's the experience of the flagship. You go to New York, you go to a Nike town. They were very unique. They weren't very many places. You'd go in and experience the brand head to toe, and they were incredible museums, but they weren't really running a business like a retailer would. So they look great, but ideally you weren't doing the kind of business out of them based on the square footage and the cost per square foot. So then, you start partnering and doing smaller things. So a lot of the brands started doing these little mini shops where they do like a women's only shop or a running only shop, and it would go in a very selected location so they could kind of build more community and attention around the brand. But most of the larger brands right now have recognized the challenge of, working with other partners and representing their brand. So there's this big focus on direct to consumer and realizing you still have to have the brick and mortar so people can experience it, but you control more of your own destiny if you're going direct to the consumer and you're showing them your product and telling them stories and doing what you want to do. I would argue there's still a bit of a miss on some of these brands in terms of how they're representing on the digital platform, because when it comes to the commerce piece of it, I think sometimes that weighs out more than the storyteller, the beauty experience that you might get. But, I think you're always going to have both. And I think it's going to depend on the shopper, especially with COVID now, what's their comfort level to going into a shop versus shopping online. But I'm always a huge advocate of the experience, the touch and feel, the storytell, like being in a space, really, I think, builds the connection with a consumer and their brand. So to be just purely online, I think you lose a little bit in the mix there.
I think if I may, David, just on this point, and I absolutely agree with Christine, we were all looking for that distinctive, one of a kind retailer that will bring new experiences, or this well-established retailer that would create immersive, experiential, physical stores. So to bring this into our shopping environment, and that was the trend. The trend was to bring more experiential stores into our shopping centers, to increase the F&B component. That will be interesting post-COVID, but pre-COVID, I mean, how many food halls did we open in Canada? How many food halls were we opening? Was opening in the US?
Yeah,
one a week, right? So the whole F&B component, which in essence comes from Asia a little, because when you look at the percentage of retail space being occupied in the various categories, in Asia, it's around 20-25% is devoted to F&B, and here we were at 5, 6, 7, and then we were all moving towards double-digit percentage of space dedicated to F&B. And then there was the entertainment component. Location-based entertainment was also slowly, unfortunately, George, I would have loved to bring you to the partnership we created at Vaughan Mills called Creative. This was going to open in 2019. We worked 2 years on this. That was one of a kind backstage experience, 25,000 square feet, GV done with IC and Cirque du Soleil under the brand Creative. And it was under construction. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit. Cirque went from selling, I don't know how many tickets per day to 0 worldwide. So it changed the whole dynamic. But those trends, right, were there pre-pandemic, and then I'm of the opinion that the whole notion of experience economy post-pandemic will explode. But in between, I think there'll be interesting discussions about the business model between the tenant and the landlord.
Yeah, I've sort of been quite quiet during this conversation because I've been listening to all the different views and not being in the real estate kind of thing. I think that there was a narrative about a retail apocalypse, and we talked about it before this conversation, and some of that was driven from changes in the US market just resulting in things in Canada, and like as we talked about previous to the call, that previous to this conversation, Target coming in, leaving, creating a big potential square footage problem, and all that business that did go into Target got spread around the Canadian retailers again. Then Sears collapse, got spread around the Canadian retailers still here. We've had various brands withdraw from the market. It's not been necessarily a good market for them, or they just don't understand it, whichever way it is. And the answer to when I've thought about 3 or 4 years ago, what's the solution to this? The solution was mixed use. Just develop into mixed use, throw a few condos in there, as you've suggested, maybe build a sort of experiential thing. But I would question that surely the mall should be a destination. If it hasn't met that initial criteria, is it a destination, guys? If it isn't, what do we have to do with this mall to make it a destination? What kind of retailers do we have to drag, screaming and yelling into our mouth, put them in prime position to bring traffic in? Everybody wins from that. So as we kind of walked into 2019, 2020, we started to see a version of a retail apocalypse actually happening. And it's all put down because we're all in this consensual denial. It's January, end of year sales. Sometimes these big things happen, and no one person actually made that point quite clearly. But I think it was now the Canadians' turn to actually experience a downgrading of consumer expectations, consumers willing to spend in bricks and mortar, and there was some, not quite frightful, but a few sizable casualties as a result of that. And then the pandemic happened. But I think in general, and I don't know this, it's just a feeling, that I think that the business model was very simple in the sense of, I get people to come into my mall, allocate the space, I put it on a spreadsheet, you're in for 7, 8, 10 years, whatever it might be. That allows me to pay off my investors who tend to have a fixed capital kind of requirement, like pension funds and stuff. And everything was in equilibrium. And I think we touched on this earlier in one of the points you made, Claude, is that rental was becoming bigger and bigger as a percentage of cost, percentage of sales for individual retailers. And I think that as we walked into 2019, 2020, before what you would call it hit the fan, I could see lots of companies declaring, ones that are public, declaring, sort of borderline, if not losses. And that wasn't going to bode well for 2020 without the pandemic. And it's in some ways, it was, for me, it was all about this business model of, we've got to have fixed income because our people who pay us need fixed income. Of course, the pandemic threw that up in the air. So I think...
Isn't that a case though, Gary, that you've got two universes that have to work together, but maybe when everything's fluid and buoyant, it works. But we're seeing now that they have very different operating economics, and now suddenly the mismatches are becoming more apparent. I don't know.
Yeah.
And way more, and David, if I may add, way more apparent on both sides.
On both sides, yeah, exactly. It's not fitting as well.
This to me is critical going forward, because it's not only just on a traditional recession, which is not necessarily affecting the market, in the same way across the board. This is nobody's immune to what's happening. And everybody just went from 2019 to 2030, okay, in a matter of months. It's as simple as that. And then you have to step back and look at your business model, how you execute your projects, how you transact, how you attract consumers. So everybody has just been hit by a reset button.
Retailers, whether they wanted to or not, were confronted with the idea they had to become faster, more flexible, more nimble and agile. When I think of your business model when you were running big real estate, I don't see that. Like that was a different beast where your payback comes far down the road. And you mentioned your concept of Vaughan Mills where you're 2 years in, and then how do they match up? Like how does that get reconciled coming through COVID out the other side? How do you see this getting navigated from the landlord side of the business?
It's a very interesting question, because I think going forward, the reaction will be dependent on how agile you are in executing what you would like to put in place for attracting consumers to your shopping environment. I just read a book recently, Reed Hastings of Netflix, and one thing he said clearly is focus on people, not process. And this whole situation that we're in right now will obviously force many organizations to go and focus on process and not necessarily people.
Just extend the point I was making about the rent being an increasing amount of cost and in turn revenue. For those organizations with extended geographical supply chains, instead of thinking about it's coming in containers and we put a bit in stock, the rest of it if we start to think in that in a different way and think about the sheer commitment we have to make in terms of cash, I think that there's a couple of collisions happening in to the point you were making about trying to be more agile. How possible is it to be more agile when we're putting a 6-month order out there and waiting for the boats to get through Los Angeles before they get into our DC, before they get into our stores? We've lost it. The whole basis is fundamentally flawed. The rent is just a trigger for a complete reevaluation of how we see retail and our cost base and how fixed these are in the, I would say, medium to long term, as opposed to if we were already doing the old retail concept where we were a general store and we bought from local artisans and brought it into our store and say, this is what we've got, Mr. Jones, what do you want? But we'd have a very short supply chain, very short commitment in the future. It may be the rent is the biggest thing because we've probably got rid of our people pretty quickly or not. But when we think about the merchandising cost, if we look at it in a different way, we will find that that's a huge commitment we're making.
I have a question. So Gary, Craig, David, Christine, Claude, I have a question, and it might be a little shocking, but are we in denial? Because, I'm not going to say we're old dogs, maybe I am, but look, ask yourself this question. What does Gen Z think of the future of shopping? It's a different, it's a different customer, right? So Claude, back to your point about focus on people versus process. So I'm asking this question of each of you, maybe we end up closing it off this way, but are we in denial? Are we fighting, and trying to save a system that maybe needs dramatic change, or is obsolete? I don't know. And I talk to a lot of people call me up who are looking for work, and I'm surprised, that they think that their model that they were working under will still be able to work under that. So I'm asking the question: are we in denial?
Well, we by the way, we have not talked about street front and we've not talked about pop-up, which were both in play before the pandemic. we're focusing on the big properties. But I will say that in the research we've done and looked at, young people do like shopping when it's really interesting, compelling, exciting, and they like going with their friends, and they like using their devices while they're there, and not just showrooming. They'll buy in stores, but if there's any disconnect either in the merchandise or just the atmosphere, if it's boring, they're out. And so their preference is really good, by their definition, good retail. And they will shop there, but they've got a lot of other choices. And I think it's everyone who's listening is going to know this. Like, the window shopping days are pretty well done. So you better have a pretty good ancillary or even co-set of digital properties that are helping support your physical. But I'm still wondering, and George, so the premise is you're putting out there, is there physical retail in the future? I'm going to say I believe there is. But there's a lot of upstart brands who aren't the scale that Claude would have been trying to lease into, his big properties at Ivanhoe. So where are they going to go, and where specifically do people want to have that physical interaction? And I don't know if COVID's changing that or not.
So I'll dive in, George, and try to answer your question. Because I would say that if our mindset is trying to salvage what we used to have before, okay, rather than redefining, transforming, redesigning the business model going forward, we're in denial.
I absolutely agree, Claude. We're in denial if we think we can just keep doing the same thing and banging our head against the wall and we're going to have a better outcome. Change is going to happen. Consumers are going to drive that change. And I think we're going to see some really cool things coming out of this, things we may not have even envisioned. And there were some really cool brands doing things before, but I just feel like there's going to be an acceleration, and the brands that will survive will be those that want to change, are willing to change, and want to innovate and do something different. And I think that's going to resonate with consumers, as well as, the Gen Z consumers. They have their tribes. They're really into their sense of community and the experience of doing things. And in many cases, they harken back to the old days of old experiences that their parents might have had. So there could be some really interesting things coming out of that, and how retail evolves and morphs from where we've seen it. So I absolutely agree with what you said.
Greg, what do you think?
Well, what I've learned over time is I know what I know, and there's lots that I don't know. And my thought is, you have to speak to the younger generation and see what they want firstly. And to forecast, you have to talk to kids that are pretty young right now. I mean, they may not know what they want. The other thing too is technological adoption. There was an article, I think it was in The Economist recently, where a guy that owns a lobster firm, they ship out boxes of lobster. He got a pair of virtual reality glasses and says, I can't wait for everyone to have these, because we could take people on virtual lobster trips. We could teach them cooking. We could basically sell the brand by this virtual reality experience. And these are things that we're not seeing in retail spaces right now, but we might, and we're starting to see this technology coming to the forefront. And I think it's exciting, but we're going to have to keep up with these things that are happening. We're not young, but some of us have kids, and we're going to have to, ask them what's going to happen and what's going on now, because that's what I'm finding is I got to talk to, I worked in university, and we have students, and they know more about what's happening than I do in terms of, the here and now and what may come. And the little kids are going to be the next decision makers in a few years as they start growing up. So it's going to be a really interesting time, but I think it's going to be a mix of what the younger consumers are doing, as well as what technologies are coming up, and how that's all going to mix together and change retail and the world, being that we're a consumer society.
Well, we're probably coming to the end, but this is definitely setting us up for a follow-on discussion, because we haven't even touched on what the future might look like in terms of all the possibilities. We're sort of exploring what the challenges are right now. And I do think, without even dealing with what happened for 1 year, we're coming up on, a year of COVID. but we're going to come out of that. There's a lot of infrastructure change given what, George, you've just put on the table. So I'm going to back that, and Christine. But in terms of what new ways of having relationships and co-development landlord-tenant, if that's even in play, if there's anything interesting about that, if there's anything new in built space and flexibility and how to lower rents and all these other factors, we need to have Claude back in. And I think that's another discussion all unto itself.
Gary, what do you think? Are
Yes,
we in denial?
So that
Like, you know what? I do believe we're in denial. You know, I sincerely believe that. I don't think everybody is, but when I look at what's happening, Craig, you nailed it, and so did Claude. You know, we all did. I mean, when you look at technology coming up the pipe, it is something amazing that's going on. And that younger generation, that Gen Z, is 11 to 28 years old. You know, in a couple of years, they're 13. They're going to have an opinion about shopping.
Oh, they already do, though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they do.
Don't kid yourself.
They do.
They do already.
You know, I heard of a young guy who that used his mother's credit card, $100,000. I'm not sure if and bought a whole bunch of shoes, and he put them on his online business and resold them and made, I'm sure, a ton of money. This is you know, a very big shift happening here, and I've said many times, you know, your next competitor might be a 14-year-old sitting on a bench, right? Playing soccer on their phone and selling. So I don't doubt any of it right now.
And short selling, right?
Oh, yeah.
Craig, we'll give you the last word, Craig.
Yeah, we'll have to have Claude back because there's so much to discuss around shopping centers, brick and mortar retail. We've talked about some of the past and the present, and I think that a future conversation is definitely going to be in order, because it's I think certainly something we'll be discussing for a while. We don't know what the future is going to be. We've just identified a bunch of issues, and maybe we could try to solve some of them. So want to thank you again. This is the Business of Retail podcast. I want to say thank you to our special guest, Claude Sirois, the former president of retail at Ivanhoe Cambridge, as well as our regular guest here. And I'm reading them in the order as they are on my screen. I've got Christine Cowan, David Ian Gray, George Menakakis, and Gary Newbury. Thank you everyone for joining. Take care.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.